Hello and welcome to The Drum. I'm Tim Palmer. And coming up, the anti-government protests intensify in Egypt. Will the mood spread to other countries in the Middle East? And how far will the Prime Minister budge to make a deal with crossbench MPs on the flood levy? And finally, should politicians and their staffers be drug tested? Our panel tonight, Shane McLeod from ABC Radio Current Affairs, David Hetherington from the think tank Capita, and in Melbourne, Tim Wilson from the Institute of Public Affairs. And thank you all for joining us on The Drum. Well, police have been ordered back onto the streets of Egypt where it's morning as protesters continue to defy curfews and express their anger at the president. Australia's Prime Minister Julia Gillard has just announced plans to make a plane available to evacuate Australians from Egypt because of the deteriorating security situation. US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton has reinforced her message for a transition to a different kind of democracy, saying stability rests on responding to the needs of the Egyptian people.
We believe that democracy, human rights, economic reform are in the best interests of the Egyptian people. Any government that does not try to move in that direction cannot meet the legitimate needs of the people. And in the 21st century, it is highly vulnerable to what we have seen in the region and beyond. People are not going to stand by any longer and not be given the opportunity to fulfill their own God-given potential.
Well, architect Sharif Morsi was among the protesters on the streets of Cairo, where he spoke to the ABC's Phil Williams.
The only way he could rule for that long is through fear. Now the fear is completely gone. So he doesn't have this apparatus anymore. Okay, it's been cooking for some time now. I mean, it's been cooking. There's been major events in the past even 2-3 months. And Tunisia, of course. And suddenly that's it. I mean, people, it's a popular movement. And I think people spontaneously, realize that's the moment.
Well, Omar Mustafa from the Australian-Egyptian Friendship Association says the protesters could dig in for a long time yet.
I'm on the phone with people from the other side all the time. They're not ready to go home. They're not going to go home. They're very high-spirited. You talk to someone and say, hey, I'm not dead there. I just lost an eye. I'm going on. I'm struggling. He's going to be down. So, yes, there's going to be some more bloodshed, unfortunately. But Hosni Mubarak is leaving the place.
Well, Hosni Mubarak, Shane McLeod, seems to be the person who this is all about. It's a very personal demonstration at this stage. I've got to ask, he doesn't appear to be in Cairo. He doesn't appear to be in Alexandria, where the biggest protests and deaths have taken place. Where is the president?
Well, the rumour is he's in Sharm el-Sheikh, a resort town over on the coast, and that might make a bit of sense because he has a fairly secure compound there inside a sort of a golf estate. I gather it's where he's hosted a number of international negotiations and the like. So if he was to be anywhere, and there's certainly people who live in that part of the world seem to think that he's about, although it's a bit hard to go out and check, and certainly if you go to the airport, it's hard to tell which of the planes might be his.
David Hetherington, I mean, if Israel's own security people missed what was happening in their neighbour Egypt, it's hard for us to have expected it. But while this is a new political entity that's arisen here, following on from Tunisia, it's an old one at the same time, isn't it, the Arab people?
That's right. I mean, there's that well-worn cliche, the Arab street, but what we're seeing here is the Arab street live and in action. And I think, no one would have thought 3 weeks ago that a single protest, kind of self-immolation by a fruit seller in Tunisia would have led to a kind of domino effect across the region. And you mentioned Israel there. I think one of the factors at play here is there's a really delicate security architecture in place that stretches from Egypt across Israel through Syria and Jordan. And, a lot of capitals around the world will have their eye on what's going on here.
Tim Wilson talking about that, about what is going on in terms of a change of balance there. The President Mubarak's letter to the new Prime Minister, Ahmed Shafiq, blamed Islamic influences for the riots. Now, obviously, the nature of the early part of the riots, we didn't really see that. But are things changing? And is that a concern for you, that we might be seeing a different kind of element creeping into this potential revolution?
started very organically. They started from people who were concerned about the future of their country, who want democracy, who want choice about who is going to govern them. There's no doubt that there are lots of groups, I'm sure, who are now active and participating because they see an opportunity. And the Muslim Brotherhood is part of that, and there may be other ones. And part of the challenge for something like a potential revolution is the importance of staying power and resilience for those who originally participated, and to make sure that no minority voice comes in and tries and successfully takes over such a push, because everyone else doesn't have the resilience to stick it out, because it's clear the President isn't that interested at this point in a regime change.
In the last 24 to 48 hours, Shane McLeod, we've seen some sort of change in the mood on the streets, largely because the police abandoned the streets. We've seen criminals enter the streets as a result, but at least the army, who do have a lot of affection from the people and some level of loyalty, the biggest organisation in Egypt ahead of the Muslim Brotherhood. How long before, though, the army's presence in the streets starts chafing as well on these protests?
This is, I think, really the question over the next few days is how the security forces interact with this. I mean, we saw those reports of the police effectively withdrawing from the streets, and now they appear to be back on the streets. At least they've been ordered to be back on the streets. And the military, I'm thinking of some of the reports we've seen from our reporters over there. Ben Knight was showing that army truck, which was actually giving people lifts around the square during the protests. So there is that. There's obviously a popular connection, perhaps, between the people and the security forces, but they're going to come under some pretty tough political control, well, at least attempts to control them, and how they react to that, I think, is really going to be the key in the next couple of days, those military forces, the security forces.
David, there's been similar standoffs like this. I mean, even back to, I noticed some of the Egyptian cartoons today were drawing comparisons with Marcos.
That's right. I mean, the Philippines, 1986, Ceausescu,
What tips
89.
the balance, though, when you get to this almost stalemate, where the people say we're prepared to stay in the streets long enough, and the totalitarian leader wants to stay on regardless? That's
right. Well, often it is the role of the military. So, you remember pictures of the Philippines in the 80s where they were putting flowers in the rifles, and eventually the army said, OK, we're on the side of the people. You get the kind of the peaceful revolution in Ukraine in 2005, again, where the military decides to take to side with the people effectively. One of the interesting dynamics here is that the security forces don't necessarily act as one. So the police and the army and the military in Egypt are seen as two quite different bodies, and the military viewed very favourably by the people, the police a lot less so. And so, as you say, the military is an extremely big and powerful organisation. Where they land in all this, I think, will significantly determine the outcome.
Tim Wilson, with the State Department, as it possibly did probably during the Philippines standoff, something talking about the Marcos situation, but are the words of the State Department, of Hillary Clinton and potentially President Obama at this stage, are they critical to the outcome?
Well, I think they are. I think we just talked about the role of the military and where it is going to sit, and what side it's ultimately going to come down on. And they're, as much as anything else, going to want to be on the winning side, which is hardly surprising. And that means our role, and I say that in sort of Western democracies, and what we send out, the messages we send out in terms of both the strength and our commitment to be prepared to be part of the solution for whatever that is, are critical. And at the moment, Hillary Clinton's words are, I would say, important, probably not strong enough, and perhaps a little bit guarded, because I do agree with the sentiments, but I think we should be rattling the cage much more, which is more likely to both get the government to look at its options about reform, but also perhaps to get the military in the end to say, well, we're with the people, we demand change, and there might be a very positive and constructive outcome for democracy for the country and for the promotion of free rights and individuals. Because
the Americans have reason to be cautious about that, don't they, Tim Wilson? Jimmy Carter made comments like that when the anti-Shah demonstrations were taking place in Iran, very much giving comfort to the demonstrations, very much telling the government not to act, but very much ending up with a situation that wasn't in his interests.
I'm not disagreeing that they need to be cautious and they need to time their language carefully, and I hope Certainly WikiLeaks shows that there has been a lot of collection of information of US agencies around the world, and I hope they're continuing to keep good information on how this issue is developing. So I'm not doubting that Hillary Clinton has access to lots of information and her decisions are well informed. I just hope that we hear something a bit stronger when it's appropriate to make sure that as much is done as possible to support those who want a democracy in Egypt, fundamentally.
David, does it worry you what kind of democracy that might be if there was a revolution, given, for example, the fact that Egypt is the key ally on paper, treaty with Israel, unpopular. A lot of protests are holding up signs which include a Star of David, with Hosni Mubarak's face with the Star of David on, accusing him of treason. Is that a concern to this delicate architecture you talk about?
No doubt it's a concern. And when you hear that the Muslim Brotherhood are acting as a kind of a pivotal force here, and when they've come out in favour of el-Baradei as the putative kind of successor to Mubarak and opposition leader in waiting, if you like, you've got to ask yourself hard questions about the type of democracy Egypt might end up with. And as Tim says, for the Americans, there's a very, very fine line, very delicate balance to tread here, because they've been very vocal about the support and the re-engagement or the re-establishment of democracy in Iraq and Afghanistan, but have by the same token been a strong ally of Mubarak, and implicitly have said, that's the kind of democracy that we're willing to accommodate in the region. To come out now and say, gee, that this is not the democracy we're in favour of and supportive of is a bit of a shift of position that they're going to have to negotiate carefully.
All right, well, we'll be coming back to Cairo and Alexandria, and it seems Sharm el-Sheikh, from what Shane McLeod's saying, in a bit later in the program. But to Australia now, and the Prime Minister has been meeting with independent MPs, trying to make sure her flood levy passes through Parliament. With the opposition refusing to back the plan, she needs the support of the crossbench in both houses. Independent MPs Tony Windsor, Bob Catter, Rob Oakeshott and Andrew Wilkie all favour a permanent natural disaster fund, and independent Senator Nick Xenophon agrees a levy alone is not the answer.
I want there to be a long-term solution to this. Just having a one-off levy won't solve this. It needs to involve cooperation between the government and the insurance industry, and we also need some fundamental changes to the law when it comes to contracts of insurance.
Well, Julia Gillard says Tony Abbott is playing politics over the flood levy, and that will backfire.
Tony Abbott has just come out against the levy holus bolus, despite the fact that he's been a supporter of levies in the past. So this is, him looking for political advantage.